Welcome to the Daily Soul Bar Show. I am your host, Bolaabimbola, frequency alchemist, life coach, and energy practitioner. And Daily Soul Bar Show is where we invite guest authors, coaches, and entrepreneurs from the fields of spirituality, psychology, and leadership to share their insights for the expansion of collective consciousness. And today I have a returning guest, John Hernandez, who will be talking to us about alchemy. And I will share one of the previous interview. It was about stepping into alchemy. But on this episode, we're going to go deeper into how alchemy really is something that all entrepreneurs can begin to embrace and embody more in the day-to-day. So I'm really glad to have John here. Welcome to the show again, John.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
Thank you, John. I'll read a bit about your bio for those who may not have been familiar with the first episode. John Hernandez is the CEO and co-founder of a multi-million-dollar corporation, and he owns two other companies, including an international wine brokerage and a coaching business. John is an instructor with the International Alchemy Guild and has published works. He works with CEOs, business owners, entrepreneurs, and teams to use the ancient, really, this is about using the ancient symbols and the ancient art and science of alchemy in a contemporary way to help adjust their internal landscape, really, to create the life that they want to live. So this is really who John is. And I'd love you to tell us, John, about your foundation, because last time we spoke more about the Alchemy Guild. If you tell us a bit more about your foundation and really what your work is for business entrepreneurs in particular.
Absolutely. So there's two things around that. The foundation that's now in full blossom, I'll say, is called the Domus Hermeticus, or the House of Hermes Foundation. It's based in Malta. It was actually a vision of one of my students. And she asked me, would I like to come on board and help do some teaching and things, and maybe do some retreats out in Malta. She's got a beautiful center for that. And I said, sure. And then that blossomed into now an international educational nonprofit foundation based in, of course, in the EU. And we've now have world-class PhD faculty members teaching not just alchemy, but also other philosophical correspondences to alchemy, the Hermetic arts and sciences, Eastern alchemy, all kinds of things. And then practical everyday life. How do you incorporate this technology into cooking and into art and into music? And we just had one of the top Egyptologists do a really nice talk on alchemy in ancient Egypt last weekend. So we're doing a lot with that. So the Alchemy Guild is still very much alive, but all the education portal is now done by us at the Domus Hermeticus. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into resources for those that want to take a bit of a deeper dive. So.
Thank you, John. And I really do want to delve into spiritual alchemy, because a lot of the times we talk about the soul being there's this metaphor that really alchemy is about how the soul becomes transformed as metal into gold. Could you talk a bit about what this metaphor really means, how alchemy works with the soul?
Sure, absolutely. And one of the tenets of alchemy that we're really taught is spiritual is one of three parts. There's the physical, which is us talking right now and our bodies. It doesn't need to be specifically working with metals or plants. And it's the psycho-emotional, and it's the spiritual. And the way we work in alchemy is it's equilibrium. We balance all those three. And by doing that opens up the spiritual channels. So it's really difficult. In alchemy, we don't jump over into spiritual. It doesn't really work that way. We have to really purify our psycho-emotional landscape first, and then that opens us up to the vertical axis, which is the spiritual. And there's no hierarchy. The spiritual is not better than the psycho-emotional or than the physical. It's all interrelated. So so by doing that work, it allows us then to open up that, what I call the conduit, into spiritual alchemy. And what is that? There was an interesting conversation I had with some folks recently about the difference between being spiritual and being connected to spirit. And with alchemy, it's really about being connected with spirit, and however you define what that word means. So it is an important part, and it's no more or less important than the other pieces, to lay the groundwork so that we can do the spiritual work. And then when we do the spiritual work, we bring it back down to earth. There's a famous writing called the Emerald Tablet, which many people have heard of, many have not. But in there it says, its inherent strength is perfected if it is turned into earth. That means we don't stay in the spiritual world. We get a piece of what we might need, and then we apply it. So you talked about how do we work this in tools in everyday life. That's really where the rubber meets the road. How do we apply what we learn here and then take something else and bring it back up? So in alchemy, that's called the distillation phase of the work, where things rise, they condense, and then they fall back down, heat up again, condense, come back up. So that's the distillation style. Excuse me, distillation piece in alchemy. I don't know if that was too wordy or not, but that's
no, that's perfect, because see, this is really about us understanding that consciousness. This is the life force that we are. Each and every one of us is an infinite piece of. That consciousness is embodying that physical body, and it's also about consciousness embodying creating that reality that we are perceiving. So we are the ones creating that reality, and consciousness is consisted in that physical body, but also it's coming from that spirit self, and consciousness is coming into the spiritual, into the physical body, and then it's staying in that astral plane as the higher self. And I would really want us to really talk about how that consciousness, and you've already mentioned this, that this is about working through that body consciousness, that ego system, and ensuring that ego system is surrendering to some degree to allow that higher self, that spiritual consciousness, to come into to actually drive the day-to-day and create. And I would really love to hear more about how that body consciousness, the psycho-emotional that you mentioned, and the physical aspects of alchemy really is something that we can bring into our day-to-day. How can the average entrepreneur or the evolved entrepreneur really come to understand how the physical and the psycho-emotional aspects of alchemy can become a day-to-day thing as they manifest their business, their goals? And this is about allowing consciousness to drive that day-to-day. How does that, somebody who comes to Domus Hermeticus, for instance, how can they begin to use your teachings to manifest their day-to-day entrepreneur goals?
Well, that's a lot you mentioned. So a couple of pieces I got from that question. First, the art of surrender, and I'll call it the art of surrender. Surrender in many cultures today has a rather challenging concept. In other words, some think that surrender equals weakness or equals giving up or giving in, when surrender is about expansiveness. It's about letting go of what might be, or attachments is another word for that, and allowing things to come. So I think that's very much in line with what you're asking. And then the second part is, well, so how do we do that? Or what do we do? What steps do we do to do that? So like I was earlier mentioning, the first thing is to purify the psycho-emotional landscape. Why? Is because that's where everything seems to meet. That impacts our physical well-being, that impacts how we see the world, that impacts how we see ourselves. And until we start getting connected to who we are truly, it's really hard to then manifest what the life that we want outside of that. So the first thing is doing the equilibrium work of our psycho-emotional language. And I think the easiest concept there is the concept of the head and the heart. Raise up a little bit. Head and the heart. So, or the conscious, self-conscious and subconscious, or the male and female archetypes, the energetics or emanations of the male and female archetypes. Not gender, but the energetics. And so by fusing those together, which is a big part of the work of alchemy, and working in those worlds, we can create the power, we can create the ability to see our true authentic self, which sometimes can be called the Philosopher's Stone, for those that have heard that term. And that's really where the fusion of the spirit, what you were talking about, that divine spark that lives in all of us, or however you want to hold it, and the soul. And those two pieces meet in that place. And once we do the work to uncover that, then there's a lot of freedom and a lot of possibilities. Because why? I'm not having to be a certain way that I think the outside world wants to perceive me. Now, from that work, and I can dive a little deeper on how to do that work, but from that work then comes physical ease as opposed to physical dis-ease, meaning there's a relaxation of the body. There's more openness in the body. It's more apt to want to take care of my body more. So that's a very physical part of it, because the body is the temple. Without that, we don't really have the rest of it to work with. And then naturally from that surrender piece comes in unconsciously. It just happens, and then miracles start to appear. Coincidences, which we call synergies, start to appear. All kinds of interesting things, because now I'm not working at opening up my spiritual conduit. It is absolutely there now. So the work, there's a very specific order in which we do the work. So how do you relate this to business? Well, there's, and I might have mentioned this last time, but there's a lot of great business strategies and techniques and how-tos out there. And there are some really good pieces on how to work with other people. There's not as many to get you from you to that starting point. And that's really where alchemy comes in. It really opens up your own true self. You said higher self. That's one way that people know what it is, but it's also our eternal self. It's also our authentic self. And from that then comes everything else. So that's why the most important part in the beginning of the work is that phase of balancing those two archetypes, or we really then split it into four. If you really want to look at earth, fire, water, and air in alchemy, two of those are male aspect emanations and two are female. So earth and water are female, air and fire are male. But we're balancing all four of those in order to then do the rest of the work. Now, the question it may be, well, how do you do that? And there's a lot of ways we do that in alchemy. Should I continue, or should I?
Yes.
Am I speaking?
No, definitely. This is really key. This is where,
okay.
Yeah.
So one of the oldest tried and true methods that goes back to the pyramid texts, so we're looking at 5,000 years old or more, is doing active what we call in today's work active imagination. It can be called, that's related to astral travel. It's related to guided meditation. All those pieces are the same. It's about really working with the imagination. And what impacts the imagination most are images. As an example, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably going to remember, if we're lucky, 4% of everything I'm saying. But if I showed you an image and we worked with an image, immediately that image will evoke an emotional response. That emotional response will then adjust a behavior that you want to adjust, and that'll propel you forward in what you're trying to achieve. That's where the manifestation comes in. So active imagination has been in alchemy since the earliest days. And basically, if you think about it, everything, going to the moon, making a toaster, all these things happen in the imagination first, and then we're manifested. So we're taught to train and work in that world a lot more intentionally, I'll say. So that's alchemy, and that has been alchemy. That's a part of the work. So doing that work, using images, and if you want, I'll show you a quick example of that.
Yes, please do. Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to take an image here. And for those of you that are listening and not looking at this, this is an image from the Arthurian mythos, the King Arthur story. And this is an image of the Lady of the Lake presenting Excalibur, the sword, to Arthur. So there's a lot to unpack here, but basically this is the marriage of the male and female archetype. The female archetype is holding the finished product. But if you look at what makes a sword is made of two things primarily. It starts with iron, and that iron gets heated up to a red hot molten level and then poured into a mold. Well, what would happen if you stopped your work right then and there? And if you tried to use it in that state? Well, it would kill you and it would burn down everything around you. So you have to quench it in the waters of life or in the feminine. And once you do that, once you quench the sword, putting the sword in the water, I'm making this very general, by the way, that iron turns into steel. And now it can hold its edge, it can hold its flexibility, and its true strength is manifested. So this is what this image shows. And of course, there's a lot more going on there, which I won't go into now, unless you want to be one of my students. But the image then will immediately evoke that emotional charge and start helping you balance where strength really comes from, because it's not all one or all the other. It's not all water and it's not all fire. Until it's balanced, it doesn't hold its true strength. So that's a pretty esoteric example, but that's how we use imagery as one example. Because I don't have to talk about it anymore. I can just say, Lady of the Lake. And automatically, if you've worked with this image enough, it's going to evoke an emotional charge immediately. So how do you use that practically? Okay, I'm in my car. I have a meeting that I'm presenting to 100, let's say, shareholders, and it's critical. And I need a little piece of extra energetics in order to be my true confident self, to remind myself that, you know what, I have what I need. And so I can bring up an image in my imagination that I've worked with, and immediately it's going to propel me with that extra energy that I need for that moment. That's one example of how we use this in a practical world, everyday life.
No, that is brilliant, John, because really at the end of the day, this is about how we as empowered beings can begin to understand how we have evolved over lifetimes. And there are certain data, there's certain information that is within us, not just within the body consciousness, but in that energetic field that we can begin to activate in different ways. The information is already there. We are such powerful beings. And I would love you to talk a bit more about the Philosopher's Stone and how the guy walking down the street, the Joe Blogs, or even the evolved entrepreneur can begin to relate to it in a way that allows it to be something they treasure or something they can begin to work with in their day-to-day.
Sure. Well, the Philosopher's Stone, depending on who you talk to, has many meanings. My belief is that the Philosopher's Stone exists in each of us already. It's not something out there. A lot of folks want to try and find something out there to fix what's in here. Perhaps that's a possibility, but I haven't seen anybody walking around the street that's 400 or 500 years old yet. So it really has to do with our internal essence. And in alchemy, the end metal that everything gets transmuted or transformed into ultimately is gold. And gold is an incorruptible metal. Incorruptible, it's pure, it's dazzling, it's beautiful. And that's the part of what we talked about, the soul, the spark, the essence that lives within us. So what happens is when we're born, we're full of wonder and curiosity, and we don't know anything else other than that. So we're in our purest philosophical stone state in that moment. And what happens naturally, culture, parents, siblings, politics, religion, friends, all these things start happening, and we start figuring out a way to survive in those many, many worlds. And what tends to happen, because we're human, is we find something that works, and there's one mask that I put on for that particular, instance or situation. And then I find another behavior that seemed to work. It's like, oh, they're laughing at me. I'm accepted now. I wasn't accepted because of sports. I was always the last one to get, I was in the soccer or football for you, and I'd always be like the last one to be picked because I was a little scrawny guy. So I figured out how to use humor to get accepted into that group. That's one mask. And so I built all these layers of masks on that helped me survive through those times, which worked great until I got into adulthood, and then all of a sudden wasn't working so good anymore. That same humor, unconsciously and unbridled, was keeping me distant in relationships. Like, where's the real John? Like, where is he? Well, I didn't want anybody to know who the real John was, because the message I thought was that I wasn't, what I had to say didn't matter. And therefore, if what I had to say didn't matter, I didn't say anything. And if what I had to say didn't matter, that really means that I don't matter. And so I lost track of that philosopher's stone. So the work in alchemy helped remove those masks one by one until I started really trusting who I was, and then can present to the world who I truly am. Not this mask, not this mask. And that became okay. And that imposter, playing that tape in the back of my head, start getting quieter. Now, it never goes away, but through this work, I learned to manage all that. So that's the psycho-emotional landscape. And from there, that opened up all kinds of things I wasn't expecting. I had no idea were even in existence. And that's the spiritual piece that you and I were talking about earlier. And that's where it really gets fun, because then bringing that in, fusing it with the soul, that's the Philosopher's Stone. And it's lifelong work. Not that you look at it and see it and, okay, I'm done. No, it's constant work. Constant work.
I totally agree, because I think something that you said really sparked there with me, and this is about how we start off being conditioned to really thrive on survival and control, whether you're male gender or female gender or no gender. There is that imbalance that we start off being conditioned with, and we come to a place as we evolve in our business or in our careers where that control no longer works, and we need to soften it. We need to come to that place of surrender. And this is not, and I totally agree with you, it's not about how we've been conditioned to see surrender as something that is that is weak, but it's about really becoming much more authentic. And really, I would like you to maybe go into a little bit more detail, in your work, and treat us as students, if you like. How do you instruct somebody who is now ready to let go of that control, and really align with the philosopher's stone within them, realign to that authentic. You've done the trauma work. You've become very aware of this higher self, this being within you, but you still kind of struggle. There's still that resistance, or there is a next level resistance to really become much more authentic within that essence of being. How do we come to release that? And it's an ongoing thing, because it's all about levels and levels and levels.
Mm-hmm.
How do we come to really let go of that, of the next level resistance that stops us from developing that trust with self and with others? Because this begins to affect our relationships, our goals, the big dollar, the big pound. How do we really begin to embody those aspects of our life, the different masks that we have on? That particular mask of being an entrepreneur in whatever field we have come to hold. How do we become less controlling, or less resistant to that higher self, to that philosopher's stone, being how we live our day to day?
Another big question. Well, one of the things you mentioned in that, and another aspect of surrender is forgiveness. And the surrender and forgiveness pieces are very much the feminine archetype. And in this case, tempering it with the masculine archetype. So the masculine archetype of fire and focus and moving through isn't always going to get you there unless you temper it again with the surrender and the forgiveness piece. So going back to that image I showed, there's where the power is. So in other words, I have to know, and I have to get, and I have to power through something, but I can't really get there until I do the surrender and forgiveness piece. So in alchemy, that's all part of the active imagination. That's all part of visiting these places and doing the work. So in alchemy, there's 7 steps. And here they are. The first one is calcination. That's the first and most fiery step where we're working with our base self. And I'm using this in psycho-emotional terms, and you'll see how the spiritual folds into this. And it's a very fiery step that burns away all the excess material that's no longer needed. And that could be the false beliefs about ourselves. So in my case, I'm an imposter, or I have to use humor in order to be accepted. Those kind of things, I can start burning those away. And that then, the end of the calcination leaves an ash stage in the work. And this ash stage is only the beginning of the work, because next thing you need to do is the dissolution stage, which is a water stage, and that's dissolving the ash, dissolving that into something where there's a piece of forgiveness in there, a piece of surrender in there. That's our emotional body, pouring the emotion into that container with the ash. What does all this cost me in my life? These masks, they cost me something. Now I get to look at it and really feel it and put that into the beaker, so to speak. Then the next stage is called separation. It's an air stage, where this dissolved solution is then dried out, and you usually get 2 core essences in that. So again, we spoke about head and heart. It could be shadow and gold. I didn't really talk about the shadow, but that's part of this. It could be consciousness and self-conscious and subconscious. Those 2 core pieces that are part of us all the time. The 4th step and the final balancing step of what are called the horizontal planes, or the fire, water, air, and earth, is the earth stage, called conjunction. That's where we conjoin those 2 essences into one. So this is called the chemical wedding in alchemy. This is the merging of the male and female archetype. The yin and the yang in Eastern is the perfect description of that. It's equal essences of both. And that's a very sovereign place. The king archetype for men, queen archetype for females, for women. And that particular part of the work, you might think, oh, well, we're done now. That's great. We've done all this work. Yes, but that's also the most dangerous part of the work, because if we stop right there, then what I talked about, shadow, these pieces come in saying, guess what? I know more than you. And now I become grandiose. I can become grandiose in that moment and get the grandiose shadow. I can become narcissistic now, unless I finish the stages. So the next stage in alchemy is a two-part stage called fermentation. The first part is putrefaction, or the death of that beautifully conjoined piece, and it begins to rot. But what happens, like if a grape or fruit begins to rot, it turns into alcohol, the sugars, sweetness, and it changes into something different. And alcohol, and we've heard the word spirit. Well, it literally becomes the spirit. So you've now spiritized matter, which is another part of alchemy. So now we've dissolved the ego body, let's say, or the ego or the mask's body, not the ego itself, and we've released the spirit. So now that's the opening of that spiritual conduit I was just talking about. And now that distillation that I was talking about early on is an ongoing and long process. And then eventually you get what I call the second conjunction, or the coagulation. You coagulate everything. So the divine spark and the soul become merged, and the Philosopher's Stone is born at that point. Because now I get to see that I am a part of the divine. That same part that lives in every star and every galaxy there is. And that's proven by science. Every element in us is in the stars. We are all connected, interconnected in that way. It's not some fantasy philosophy, it's actual. So that part that birthed the Big Bang in the field of nothingness, and we have a lot of creation myths where there's this vast ocean, or the nothingness, or the amount of space before there was time or matter, there was a thought. This is that active imagination, or a word that was spoken, and what we now know comes into existence. So we're a part of that legacy. But oftentimes in everyday life, it's hard to think about that, or we may forget. So alchemy is about reminding, and it's about constantly doing that work. Because again, it's not one and done. It's a lifelong work. And the word alchemy translates to magnum opus, which means the great work, because it is the great work. Doesn't mean that it's hard work. It is hard at some points, but it can be fun, but it's ongoing. That's the good news and the bad news.
Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of those are the actual steps.
Yes, that's really powerful, because it really takes us from that place of non-awareness into a deeper understanding of those imprints, and a dissolution of the imprints, and into the allowing and the surrender and the ownership, because it takes a lot of audacity for us to really own the limitless worth, the limitless worth. And as well as the creative power that is already within us, that is within that Philosopher's Stone. I'd love you to bring this back to our day to day. So we have entrepreneurs who you have worked with, John, over the years. What would you say are the very common patterns that exist in the way that we have been conditioned to carry out business? And this is about the business of the future. How do we understand those patterns? If you could just share some of those patterns with us, and how you have come, the most common limiting patterns, and how you have helped, and how your insights can help to push us forward into what you would consider to be a more abundant, or a more fulfilling approach to business.
So again, equilibrium comes into this slash balance. And I think the most important pattern that's part of the human condition is that, again, we have these false beliefs or these shadows that Jung called them. And I think the most important part of the work, the beginning part again, and the ongoing, is finding where those shadows are. And in alchemy, we call them dragons, and where they live and what they're trying to do. Ultimately, then this becomes a bit esoteric, but ultimately we find out what they really want. And then we feed them and we give them that. Then they hold less power over. So again, how does that translate into business? Well, it can get a bit complicated. And here's why. Because my set of dragons might be different than yours. There may be some similarities, but they're different. And what happens when my dragons are running the show unconsciously and your dragons are running your show unconsciously? Now they're out to play. So the real you and the real me are unconsciously watching this play out, and that's where disconnection, so if we take it in a very practical business sense, that's where teams fall apart. That's where bosses want to micromanage and they don't trust anybody, or they're far too much in the fire area and they're not tempered. So it's tyrant all the time. And what happens? People start quitting. And then ultimately the fruit or the abundance of the business isn't met because of all these things. Most likely because this dragon's playing with this dragon, neither of the two primaries are aware of that. So by doing the work first with the individual, we identify and we work with that. From there, as we spoke about, comes the spiritual piece, which then really opens up all kinds of other possibilities, being able to see and hear things, and really get that intuition moving. And then we work as the team, and we work with the team so that it becomes ultimately the point where there's consciousness around what's going on. And the end result is a flourishing team, one of abundance. Competition is good, but not to the point where I want to see that person fail so I can win. It's more of, I want to see that person win so I can win. And we can both be abundant. We can both be in joy. So I'm going to root for that. My whole philosophy is I want my students to surpass me. I want my employees in my company I want to have to write them huge checks. That's my favorite time. When, other folks are like, why am I paying that kind of money? No, I want to pay that kind of money because they're happy, they're producing, I'm happy, everything's good. So it's using this alchemy work in a very conscious, practical business way and personal, because all those same things I just mentioned has to do with relationships or fatherhood or motherhood and getting along with other people in your community and working with them. So it's all part of the related work.
So that's so powerful. And I totally agree with you, because there is that need, even as a conglomerate, as a leader of a conglomerate or as a leader of a team, to understand that relationship itself really is where the team goals or the conglomerate goals really thrive, really come into understand and trust self, and allowing that higher self, that philosopher's stone, to really begin to encompass the needs of everyone. And sometimes we see this concept of thinking of everyone as a dirty word, where how am I going to thrive or survive in this business world, in this very competitive structure. And this is really where I think, and I always often say this, where we cannot sit on the fence about whether we live in a world of abundance or a world of lack. And knowing that we live in a world of abundance, that allows us to open up to viewing the needs of others as our own needs as well. And it's about a win-win in the community, in the business, in the team, in the relationship, because this is really where we get our best outcomes. And I really do want to thank you, John, for coming today. And do you have any final words that you'd want to share with us in this way where we are wanting to bring alchemy more into our day-to-day, in our relationships, in our business, in merging the different parts of us, merging the different masks that we wear, so that we can really come to live our most fulfilling lives on this journey? Do you have any final words for us today?
Sure. Well, first of all, some resources. There's a lot of people say, well, where do I even begin? Because alchemy is such a vast subject, and what do I do, and what book do I read? And you get a lot of questions like that. So now with the foundation fully up and running, and you'll probably put that in the link chat,
Yes.
domus.hermeticus.world, is we have an alchemy study program that's divided into 7 modules, and it's in a linear order so that it does this work. So you'll learn about alchemy. It's not so esoteric that you know you're not going to understand it. It's very well laid out. It was written by one of the premier alchemists of our day, Dennis William Hulk, who has many, many books out there. And it's evolved, the work's evolved a little bit over time. And that's a great way and an inexpensive way to get started with just the world of alchemy and how some of these principles work. And there's a whole module on alchemy in everyday life, funny enough. But you have to get through the first parts first in order to get to that. And then secondly, my own coaching website, alchemycoachinginstitute.com. If it's more specifically business related and you're not as interested in learning the philosophical side, but you want to take these principles and apply it pretty quickly in your life and working with your teams and working with all that, I'm very confident and familiar with that. I've been a trainer for years and years and years, and so I know how to bridge those worlds really well. And so, or you want to do keynote speaking, anything like that. So they're 2 different worlds, but related. So we have resources for both. You can feel free and reach out to me on either of those sites. Yeah, be curious, be fiercely curious. Being curious will open up that abundance that you were talking about. And again, there's trillions of galaxies. That means that the universe is a very abundant place. And these possibilities are here, and miracles become commonplace. Is it a lot of work? Yep. But is it really rewarding? Absolutely. But I'll leave it with that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. That's so powerful. And I do really want to thank our audience for joining us today. This has been a really fascinating and insightful conversation. Thank you again for joining me today, John.
Thank you so much for having me, and be well.
And I would really love to thank our audience for joining us and listeners, and to ask you to subscribe to Daily Soul Bytes show. And don't forget to grab your copy of Daily Soul Bytes, my book, which talks about the different perspectives within us, the higher perspectives of love and the lower perspectives of fear, which is really about understanding the diversity of perspectives within us and knowing what we are achieving with those perspectives. It's not just a one, it's quite immense. The polarity of perspectives within us are immense, and beginning to use alchemy to really merge all those parts of us and understand who we truly are. This is the life we have come to live. And I do invite you to join me again for the next episode of the Daily Soul Bytes show next week. Take good care. Bye-bye.